So we have this clear pointer. It's pointing us toward the ancient past and pointing us toward the fact of terraforming by showing us a diagonal. As we move back up the bank, we can see the diagonal construction as well. So here it's pointing this way, okay? Endlessly diagonal, endlessly constructed. We have these thin gypsum layers, concretized gypsum. In the Bosnian Pyramid Complex, it's baked adhered claystone layers. Here it's baked adhered gypsum layers. Here's the seam between sections. And the seam goes through those two layers. Oh wow, how'd geology do that? So that's supposed to be two time periods, right? The layer on the right is supposed to be a different time period from the layer on the left. And yet this line transverses both of them. The wind has come up a bit, but we can still see in this fresh spring water fed river the construction of the ancients beneath. This river lasted millions of years. The Sabinal River has lasted much, much longer than human history. The ancients built in sections. Here's a riverbed. This is the Blanco River near Wimberley, Texas, in central Texas. And just like right at the entrance of KTK Tunnel in Bosnia, off the Bosna or Bosnia River, this is the same angle that the ancients used there. All the way across this diagonal that goes all the way across the riverbed. That's what they did right outside KTK Tunnel entrance in Visoko, Bosnia. Absolutely amazing. Tens of thousands of years. And the tunnel goes left and right. There's not enough light in there to show you what's in there, but I did make a video. That's the built river. You can see I was just thinking today as we were making, just before I turned the camera on, I was thinking the reason that they have a step down here, a really quick step down, is because the negative ions can be generated by turbulence, and then the negative ions get sucked into the tunnels and they're used by the pyramids. It's pretty crazy. I mean, it's pretty wild what the ancients were doing with natural materials and just, you know, with advanced engineering know-how. Wow. So the ancients had a similar engineering across the world. It may have been the same race, it may have been a different race. Well, it's December 9th, 2020, and we are here at a little creek that goes into another little creek in central Texas. And we're just going to diagnose this ancient terraforming. Let's begin. The verticality of the sectioning. So they built from left to right. So on the left was the section, and they make it like a cake, different layers for specific reasons. Okay, these layers are laid down for scientific reasons. The ancients used soft earthquake mitigating layers, and we can see those eroded out, alternating with hard structural layers. And then on top, a more mottled texture, but even the mottled capping layer, meant to protect the other layers, has these straight line section seams in it that go right through all these, quote, sedimentary layers, right? So that's ridiculous. That's not geology. Can't be, because nature could not put a vertical line through many different time periods, and that's what geology says that is happening here. They're saying, oh, that's just a fracture, it's a crack. Really? Oh, okay. This is so ridiculous on the face of it. One of the important things to notice about this particular section break that the ancients created as they laid down their concrete to create riverbanks and valleys and mountains and hills, is that in creek banks and riverbanks, we have found consistently that the ancients used diagonal construction. So the flow of the creek is this way, right? So you've got your 45 right there, which doesn't mean that there aren't also other lines, but generally what we find is you can see the diagonal structuring all the way through the layers. Okay, so I'm gonna put the camera vertical like this so you can see all all of those together, okay? So that's one line. Geology will say, well, ignore that. Don't even talk about that. Oh, okay. And the roots got into this too. Interesting, right? So on the left, a layered concrete cake. I should call this video Concrete Cake, but I think I'm going to call it The Great Adventure. Science, The Great Adventure. They built the continents, and the evidence is everywhere. If only we could get out from under the university's nonsense. Again, we see the one line that goes through all those, quote, time periods. Total nonsense. That's not geology, that's sectioning with concrete. It's so obvious once you see it. But the ancients didn't build like we would, right? We would make everything regular. Well, things aren't regular with the ancients. So we have the capping concrete, which is modeled, and then less modeled, right? And then the softer layers even less modeled for the tops, right? But that's pretty textured, but then really, really modeled here. Interesting, right? We could speculate that the modeling has a purpose, and that the purpose might be to slow water down. So when water is, to slow erosion down, slow the process of erosion down. So when water is cascading over this waterfall, which they built, by the way, yes, there has been erosion, but they built this steep incline. This is the level that the creek bed existed at, and it has existed at for its entire lifespan, right? And then the next level is down there. So this really modeled creek bed, really modeled, I mean, incredible, would help to slow the water down and slow erosion down. We look at nature as beautiful. When people post photos on social media, they don't post a photo of a building. They post a photo of nature. And they'll post photos of rocks and trees and forests and rivers. And it turns out that the rocks aren't rocks. They're ancient concrete. Interesting, right? 90-degree angle. But then we have the pointer, the 45-degree angle. Interesting, right? Saying, this is constructed. If you missed the other things, 45 to the flow of the river, right there. All right, and that line goes through all those layers. How did that happen? I guess it just happened, Things just form and things just happen because reasons. Straight lines that are vertical, right angle vertical lines through, quote, sedimentary layers, plus a bunch of thin layers, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's say 11 layers, all right? One line. Wow, amazing. So no matter where we look on this creek bank, the evidence continues to support the terraforming theory. See that straight line? That's a vertical line. Vertical line through many layers. Smooth face sections. I wonder how nature did that. And the line continues through many layers. One line through many layers. Impossible, right? But institutional geology will say, don't even worry about it. It's just a crack. Oh, really? Okay. This is Jock Doubleday reporting from a little creek in central Texas. I hope everyone has a scientific day, a non-hallucinatory day, a day in which we can see the ancients' continental terraforming for what it is. A large-scale concrete project in the distant past. Diagonal construction. Diagonal to what? To the flow of the river. So we have 45-degree diagonal construction of large plates, large sections, as I call them. All right? So you can see the diagonal construction. You can see the point inward and the point back, right? Because whenever you have a point inward, you're going to have a point back. Now this one's less obvious. We've got basically a parallel line that's kind of fragmented there. But we see the general diagonal construction. So that's a 45 to the flow of the creek. two 45s to the flow of the creek. Geologists would call this a crack, a natural crack, right? Supposedly a natural crack. Does it look like it's fracturing apart? Supposedly a natural crack. They also call these cracks joint fractures, which is an oxymoron. It's meant to destroy thought. It's meant to destroy understanding. There's no such thing as a joint that's also a fracture. So, would you say that this is breaking apart right here? Or is it being joined together strongly by a seam? Now you'll see that there's no cracking, no fracturing, no cracking, no fracturing, all integral. Here's a tiny little but then suddenly we have this integral line, right? No cracking, no fracturing, no cracking, no fracturing, no cracking, no fracturing. Textured on the top, yeah, but there's no cracking or fracturing. Then we have this line that shows us a seam or a joint. These are being joined together at this seam, at this joint, very strongly. You can see how rough it is, corrugated. But in the interior, on the section faces themselves, this is quite regular and smooth, this material. Why is this chaotic and rough? But the interior, which is supposed to be a crack or a fracture, because this used to be inhabited by a section right here, right? That broke out. But somehow the interior of this random crack that supposedly went at essentially a right angle through this material, close to a right angle, is smooth, smoother than the material that we see represented here, this corrugation. So that's odd, right? And then we have this interesting lip also, which I've noticed many, many times and almost never brought anybody's attention to because it's so obvious that it's building that I just figure people will see that lip and go, oh yeah. So we have the general diagonal construction. The seams are going at a diagonal, right? There's this seam, and at exactly the same line, it's exactly the same angle as this seam. And these are 45s to the flow of the river, or 45s to the flow of the creek. So that's diagonal to the flow of the creek. Let's look at it more clearly. It's a 45, perfect 45. And then we also have, again, the face of the section being more regular than the top of the section. This should be more irregular because it was supposed to crack or fracture, and it has that little lip on it always, right? Here's the little lip, the construction lip, the construction face, right? Different from the corrugated material here, and the construction lips. And you say, but this looks really random. It does. This looks a lot like a crack, right? It really does. It does. But if we place it back where it was, we see that it's following the general diagonal pattern to these sections. So they didn't need to use perfectly straight lines, right? Now, also note that the interior of the section is integral. So there's no cracking anywhere in this. So it's completely strong, right? Completely strong, not one single crack. And yet, wait, here's one little crack right here. There's a little tiny crack. Still strong though. But even though this is really, really, really strong material, somehow it all came out right here. Well, that's because that's where the sections were meant to come out if they're going to come out. So, because the section seams, these seams are slightly less strong than the rest of the material. I mean, this one is slowly becoming an open seam. This one's slowly becoming an open seam. You can see it's opening a little bit because there's no support for these sections right here. They're all undercut by the erosion, right? So these are slowly starting to come out because the softer earthquake mitigating layer has been washed out, they slowly come down. Now you notice also that the sizes and shapes of these sections are different. Well, we learned from the ancients who built the pyramids, who came later, you know, they came after the true ancients who built the continents. We learned from the ancients that they used different sized blocks. I call these sections as opposed to blocks, but they are building blocks. It's just they're more like slabs, and I call them sections. So each one is different size, different shaped. They knew, just like the ancients who came later knew, the pyramid builders, that different size and different shaped sections is important for earthquake mitigation. They could have made the interiors perfectly smooth, like a Grecian or Roman smoothness to these, but they didn't. Why do they have roughness between them? Why do they have these little knobby areas? Why do we have knobby areas? Why not make it perfectly smooth? They could have, right? They could have, but they made it knobby. Why? Because the section that was in here, that little pie-shaped section that used to be there, during an earthquake, it's rubbing against, the two faces are rubbing against each other. And if they have knobby areas, this is rubbing against the section face next to it, and it's creating friction, and that keeps these together more than if they would just slide because they were perfectly smooth. So that's also genius building by the true ancients as well. But of course the true ancients, the continent builders, who built mountains, valleys, riverbeds, creek beds, hills, all across the planet, all across the continents, if they built those continents here, right? If they built these sections here, right? Then we can speculate, reasonably speculate, that they built mountains, hills, riverbeds, creek beds, valleys on other planets too. So this is not their first rodeo in building. So to them, it's all worked out. It's all been worked out in the distant past, because it's so obvious that perfect flat sides are not going to be as good in an earthquake. It's so obvious that their main objective was to make their structures last, right? They wanted their foundations for hills to last. And again, you can see this general diagonal construction, 45 to the flow of the creek. Nothing could be more obvious. So all of this was many millions of years ago, presumably, all worked out by sophisticated advanced engineers. They knew how to build lasting structures, and that's exactly what they did. Now, why didn't the geologists see this? Why haven't geologists seen the building? Why haven't they seen the construction of the planet? Why have they consistently said this is all natural? Millions of people interested in geology have said this is all natural. Of course, they're influenced by the geologists in the schools. But we have thousands and tens of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of geologists through time looking at the landscapes, looking at the terrain and saying this is natural. It's obviously natural. Let's figure out a mechanism for how it came into existence. Well, the reason that they believe that it's natural, that all of this came into existence through natural forces, every riverbed, every creek bed, every hill, every mountain, is because they hold a false premise. And that false premise is that we, Homo sapiens sapiens, we are the first advanced race in the universe. Okay? There was no one else around to build continents. And we didn't build the continents, so therefore the continents aren't built. So it's never even a question. Of course it's natural. It has to be. We didn't build the continents. There are no advanced races beyond us. We're the advanced race. We're the first advanced race. We're the first race, just by chance, by luck, to raise our heads above the muck and mire and achieve self-awareness. I mean, the hubris is astounding, but that's the premise. So they don't even keep it as an open question. All of academia is stuck in this weird hubris-filled state. It's a prison. It's paralyzing for them, because their belief that we are the first advanced race discounts virtually everything we see. Planets, suns, which all were built. Planets and suns were built. They didn't just come into existence by chance. We're just gonna explore the architecture of the hills today. We're gonna look at the ancient building that is called geology in the universities, the Rockefeller controlled universities. Rockefeller funded textbooks give the mind control programs to the professors. The professors spout that nonsense. The professors haven't been in the field. Diagonal seams, 45 to the line between the hills. We could say 45 to the flow of the river, 45 to the flow of the creek. So we found that in many, many, many gullies, creek beds, riverbeds here in Texas. It's all we find. And it makes sense from an engineering standpoint to build diagonally. Here's a seam that's coming apart slightly. Okay, and the geologists say it's a fracture. Really, is it a fracture or is it a seam in ancient concrete that came apart over time because we have raging water that comes through here? Here's a seam that came apart over time. Seams that came apart. Here's a root that busted this apart slightly. When we break the spell of the institutional geology training, it's going to be a beautiful and wonderful and miraculous thing, because people will be able to start seeing what's really here. But this seam goes up, and see how it goes through all those lines of, all those layers of, quote, sedimentary material. That means it's not sedimentary material. This, I'm gonna get really close, geologists, okay? I know you tuned out before this, and this is just regular old people listening to this video now. Geologists tuned out a long time ago because they don't want to hear anything that wrecks their paradigm. But here's this 45-degree seam in ancient concrete, and it goes straight up through, you know, thousands of years of sedimentary layers. How did that one line do that? It's amazing. Whoa, what an amazing thing nature is. No, that's a day of building. They just put all those layers down. Deep, soft bunch of layers, little tiny thin soft layers, right? Very, very smart building for earthquake mitigation. Then a harder layer. See, this one is really, really hard, molded, and that's more soft and chalky. That 3-foot tall layer made of many soft layers of gypsum, concretized gypsum, but it's softer, and that's harder concretized gypsum, and this is super hard concretized gypsum, and then it just keeps getting harder. So diagonal seams, right? So it's all we find, and the geologists are like, I was on a picnic, I didn't notice because I was eating food instead of actually looking at anything. I seriously don't know what the geologists are doing. I can't even imagine what geologists have been doing for hundreds of years, except looking at textbooks and going, let's see, I got to plan my lesson plan for the kids today, and here's what the textbook says. So you can see how this seam in ancient concrete goes through all those different layers, right? If those were sedimentary layers, again, impossible for one straight line to go through them. And you say, but maybe it could. Well, really, but then we have the smoothness of the side. Always find that, right? The smoothness. Why is it so smooth? Why is it so straight? Not perfectly straight, but why is it so straight? Why is a fracture so straight and leaving smooth interior faces? Look how closely knitted that seam is. I mean, it's unbelievable. And there's the smooth side. So here's that smooth interior face right there. And I keep wanting to make a video, see how smooth that is? That talks about the smooth interior faces of the seams of the ancients, of the sections. Because I wonder if if they meant to have these outcroppings here, or if it was just a little bit of sloppiness to not have them be flush, you know? And I think that they probably just didn't care that they had some areas that didn't meet because the stuff is so strong. They weren't worried about water perturbing it. Here's a diagonal seam again. You can see it. So it goes like 18-20 feet. Can we find any seams in this area here? One piece. Ah, here's one. It's not in the lower level, but in the upper level we've got a diagonal seam. We're here in Central Texas, wondering where the geologists are. I've never seen any geologists in any of my field explorations. I've seen geologists in movies. I haven't seen any in real life. I've never met any. I've been out in the field for, let's see, let me check my watch, several decades. Hiking, walking around, and then in the last 10 years or so exploring the archaeology of Terra, which we call Earth. I hope you have a scientific day. As we walk toward the bridge, please notice the section seams, not cracks, but seams, like seams in a garment, okay? I want to be really clear that there is no way this is natural. You see the stepping of the true ancients. See how that's one molded, massive piece. And they stepped that piece down, and then they stepped it down again. It's not sedimentary layers that have distinct horizontal breaks that would indicate different time periods. So there's no break right here. There should be a line that breaks horizontally. Because it doesn't do that, we know it's stepping. That's conscious stepping. And then we confirm that when we see the section lines, right? And the section lines, which are clearly integral, they're not fracturing. This isn't breaking apart in any sense of the word. Those seams are holding this material together. And you say, but they're not perfectly straight sometimes. They're not perfectly straight. And I say, yeah, that's okay. That's all right. Because section sizes and section shapes were purposely made to be different, to be varying for earthquake mitigation. Lots of non-square geometry, right? Lots of triangular geometry. Lots of odd sizes, odd shapes. That's what they did to keep this strong. If they had built this in similar sized shapes and similar shapes as we do with our bricks, this would have been taken out a long time ago, presumably. Anyway, so now we're coming to some more clear diagonal construction. These are 45s to the floor of the creek. Oh no, a dog leg, it must be natural. No, it's not. Because that's not a crack or a fracture. We can see it's not cracking apart. It's holding together. It's a seam. It's holding this together. It's going through that first layer, which is supposed to be a time period. Same line goes through the next layer, which is supposed to be a time period, and the same line goes through this base layer, and it keeps going through the true base layer here. So that's actually 4 layers that this goes through. So same with this one, at the same angle, this is also going through, transversing, oh, we'll have to do a dog leg, oh no, transversing all these layers. Oh, it's going off a bit, must be natural. So the true ancients crisscrossed this and made it a mosaic of different sized sections purposely, and you can see, here's my signature move. I'll just pat this. See how rough this top part is? But look how regular that side is. If that's a crack or a fracture, that should be more irregular. I'm just going to follow that line. It's a 45 to the flow of the creek. 45 to the flow of the creek, just like this one. Just like this one is. And there's another little seam that appears and disappears in about a foot. Okay, so it's all diagonal. Oh, and here's one. It's more like a... So that line meets those 45s right about here. Let's follow this line. That's more like a 70 degree. So, and we do find 70 and 90 and 45 degree angles in the true ancients, creek beds and riverbeds. But this is quite astounding, isn't it? It's not straight. Oh, isn't it? And look how it goes through all the layers. Let's just look at how many layers it goes through, first of all. That cannot be a crack, my friends. Let's follow this. Let's follow this. Ready? Do, 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 do. Going through layer after layer. So depending on how you want to define the layers here, it's been at least 2 layers. This is number 3. La-da-dee-dee-dee. Number 4. La-da-dee-dee-dee. Number 5. Now these are supposed to be time periods. These layers are supposed to be time periods. And so, how can that be? How can you have a single line transversing multiple time periods? Right? How can this line transverse 5 time periods? Well, it can't. So that means that this is not sedimentary material. This is not sedimentary gypsum. These straight lines which transverse so many different layers, right? There's another one right next to it. Let's follow the one on the right. Oh, look at that zigzag. It must be natural. And but you see that one line is transversing multiple time periods, and it meets this perfectly straight line, which transverses many, many different, quote, time periods, always in quotes with geology. The fact that any geologist would say this is natural, and all of them will, every single one, they'll just say, oh, that's a crack. It happens to be straight. Wait, let's find where this thing starts. I mean, it goes forever. Here's a parallel line, parallel to the flow, and it's meeting all of these. A little bit of a dog leg, okay. It's parallel to the flow. It's meeting all of these 45 degree lines, right? There's one of them. And this is supposed to be a crack or a fracture. Well, it's not fracturing apart. It's not cracking, but it meets the other angles. So there you go. It's the geometry of the ancients. Let's call the video the geometry of the ancients. How does that sound? La-da-dee-dee-dee. It's so obvious that it's not natural. The idea that this is natural is so comical. So comical that you'd have to put a clown outfit on every geology professor. Every one. Oh no, there's a dog leg. But you see how integral it is. You see how strong it is. Right? You see how strong these seams are. Is there any sense that these are fractures, that this material is fracturing apart? As we look at this line, let's just call it a line for now, do you feel any sense that this is a fracture or a crack, as geology would call this? Geology calls this a joint fracture, or a fracture or a crack, but a joint fracture. Because obviously these are being joined, and yet they have to call it a fracture. They can't call it a joint, because that would imply building. And they really don't want us to think that this is building. Why? There's a very good reason. The geology professors themselves aren't in on the reason, their controllers are in on the reason. The reason that it's important for us not to think of creek beds and riverbeds as built is that then we would realize we're not the first advanced race. Someone built this that's not us. Obviously we didn't build the riverbeds and creek beds. So, who did? Who did build them? Well, it had to be an advanced race in the distant past. So if we make that realization, then we're also going to realize that we are not alone. We have a galactic family, and we're going to start looking for our galactic family. Right? We're going to start wondering why we've been told that we are alone in the universe, when obviously the entire Earth is composed of creek beds and riverbeds and as the foundations of hills that are all artifacts. They're not natural. So who are our relatives out there in the galaxy? Who built this? So that's the chain of thoughts that would occur to us, you see, and the controllers don't want that. They want us to think that there's nobody out there, humanity's alone. There's really no hope at all. Just stay home, Truman. Stay home. It's scary out there. We're alone. There's a void out there. It's cold. Stay home. The void of space, which is a total lie itself. I mean, the void of space, the quote void, everything's in quotes when it comes to Rockefeller science, academic science. The void of space, in quotes, is like the sea in the Truman Show. It's like the ocean in the Truman Show. It's the thing you're supposed to fear. You can't cross it. It's too scary. You'll die out there. So we're continuing to find the diagonal sections, right? We're continuing to find the diagonal sections. Diagonal to what? Well, the road parallels the creek. The creek's on the left, so you can see that it's diagonal. It's a 45 to the flow of the creek. So this is supposed to be a crack or a fracture. All of these diagonal lines, whether they're 70 or 45s, are supposed to be cracks or fractures. It just happened that way. Really? No, it didn't. Now, I have explored up there ways, and it's the same thing. It's endless diagonal lines in really, really, really hard concrete, and the lines are all super integral. In other words, they're seams, like seams in a garment. Diagonal, 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 and it just keeps going. So, the creek's down there, but we don't have to explore it because we have the banks. We have the creek banks that tell us, show us. Here, you can see how parallel these lines are. See that? You got this guy, boom, right? Camera, same angle, boom, just like that. All right? So, we have a built structure by literally 100 different pieces of evidence. Every time we see this integral seam that transverses multiple layers of what are supposed to be sedimentary layers, and therefore what are supposed to be time periods, every time we see these lines that transverse those quote time periods, that's another piece of evidence. And we've seen literally 100 of them. The geometry of the ancients. Yeah, here it is. The geometry of the ancients. Keeps going. There it is, the geometry of the ancients. Different sized and different shaped sections. Triangular section, right? Diagonal lines. So here's the diagonal, right? And there's the flow of the creek. Creek is on our left, parallels the road. So this is about a 70 degree, and the 70 degree turns into about a 45 degree. So that's about a 45 to the flow of the creek right there. That line right there. Flow of the creek's about like that. All right. more approximate 45s to the flow of the creek, right? So there's the line. Let's see if we can get close in on it. Yeah, flow of the creek. Well, let's see, the flow of the creek is more like this, and there's the line. So we've looked at these before, so I don't want to double up on my evidence, but it is astounding that geologists call this a crack and call it natural. It's astounding. Here's a parallel line that we looked at before, and here we go, the geometry of the ancients. Here it is. Here it is, my friends. Here it is. Okay. The geometry of the ancients. Boom. Huh. Yeah. The geometry of the ancients. Parallel line. Oh, and it meets this basic 90, but it's got a curve in it. Must be natural. This is all wiggly. It must be natural. What about this one, though? Oh, well, it just stops. It must be natural. Okay. Whatever you say. But why does this creek bank have no? Why does this creek bank have steps in it, but there's no horizontal layer where the sedimentary layering was supposed to? This layer was supposed to stop right there, and then another layer starts. Well, where's the line? There is no line. They just laid the concrete and bumped it up, and they kept laying concrete, and they bumped it up, and they laid more concrete, and they bumped it up. Here's a place where it does look like you could say, oh, this is sedimentary layering, yay! Except then right here you see that it's not sedimentary layering because there's no layer there. They just bumped it up. They bumped it from here to there, right? And so the stepping is not from sedimentary layers. So we already know that, but then we see the seams as well. So we understand that this creek, called Town Creek, we understand that it's an artifact from the distant past. We see the similarity between the section seams here and the section seams in other creek beds and riverbeds around the world on 3 continents that I've personally explored with my 2 feet and my 1 camera. And I can assure you that on all of the continents that we have photographic evidence of the material for, we can find, and I have found, evidence of building. So it's on all continents that we can see the material of. So I'm leaving Antarctica out of this for now. Maybe Antarctica is natural. Okay, maybe it is. So again, the diagonal construction. Then we have the channeling that they like to do. Not sure what the channeling is exactly about. But we have the water flowing through. That means that they meant that to happen. Here's the little, barely visible seam that's diagonal to the flow. So there's the flow, there's the diagonal seam. Here's the parallel channeling, parallel to the flow. So they meant this to happen. Not sure why. They wanted to go up and down as well. So they're in channel up, and we want it to go down. And a little up and a little down, a little up and a little down, a little up. That's what they wanted. This is not erosion. There's no sign whatsoever of erosion. This is really, really, really rough corrugated material. They laid this down exactly as we see it. This stuff's super hard, okay? So we go up and we go down in this parallel channel. Why did they want the water to do that? I have no idea, but that's what they did. They did that. This is not erosion. N-O-T. Not erosion, okay? See how it's corrugated on the right? Really corrugated. You can see that it's structured, but you also see that it's corrugated, so you know it's not smoothed by time, right? And it's got this definite edge. I mean, that's not natural erosion. You've got a definite edge. Up and down they wanted to go, up and down, up and down, up and down. Why? Don't know. I do know this lasted the ages though. We are here at Town Creek in Central Texas, and I just wanted to show you some of this geology next to the creek. Okay? So here we see what geologists call sedimentary layers, right? Interestingly, these, quote, time periods are bisected vertically by this single line, right? Interesting. So we're just going to travel up, travel up, travel up. That one line going through many different, quote, time periods marked by the, quote, sedimentary layers of the geologists, right? So that's something that the geologists miss because they can't explain that. How did they miss it? I don't know. So we have this section, right? This section of ancient concrete, a layer cake of crystalline mineral magic. So let's look at this side, this section face, and we'll see the regularity to the vertical face of this ancient concrete. So do you see how smooth that is, right? Compared to the corrugation of the material. This somehow, in the interior face, is smooth. Well, a crack or a fracture, which this is supposed to be according to geology, that created this vertical feature, would be more irregular, not less irregular, right? But somehow it's quite smooth there. Then we have this section. Obviously a section came out right here, and that's why we're able to see this interior face. We're able to see the building of the true ancients who built the continents. The geology of Town Creek is telling us that this isn't geology. The geology of Town Creek is telling us that this is building. And the geologists are happy to ignore the evidence of building for reasons unknown. They don't care, I guess. The strongest evidence is right here in this straight line that bisects multiple time periods, right? It transverses multiple time periods. This is why getting out into the field is good. And I highly suggest it to professors who've been stuck in the universities. Because we see these straight lines that are creating section seams, right? It's pretty astounding what the geologists have missed. This angle, see this angle right here, this, let's say 80 degree angle in the material. Goes up, up, up. That straight line, that mimics this straight line right here. That goes exactly at that same angle, right? An upside down pie wedge there. Alright, so as we leave the channeling behind to end the video, I just want to bring to your attention this seam. It's a diagonal seam to the flow, so I'm going to follow this diagonal seam. You can't see it, it's just sort of disappeared for a while. Oh, there it is. Diagonal seam, 45 to the flow. Kind of disappears. Maybe we can pick it up, let's find out. This might be the same line. 45 to the flow. There's the creek, there's the line, and there's a neighbor 45, boop, 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 boop. It does a little curve there, oh, must be natural. Oh, there it still is. So, there you have it, Town Creek. This is Jock Doubleday reporting from Town Creek in Gillespie County, Texas, where it's still summer in the middle of winter, January 6th. 2023, 73 degrees today, and we're standing in a creek that was built by all evidence, right? We came out into the field together and we examined the evidence, and the evidence tells us clearly that this rather large creek, this river-sized creek, was built, and not just built in the distant past, but built strongly with really, really, really tight seams. That's something to be proud of. How long has that seam been here, this 45 to the flow of the creek? How long has this been here? Oh, it does a dog leg there. It's so integral. It just disappears. It just disappears. But you can pick up its neighbor right here. And you can pick up his neighbor right here. And you can pick up his neighbor right here. And they're all diagonal. They're all diagonal to the flow. Why? Because diagonal construction is the strongest construction. How do we know that? Because the ancients, the true ancients who built this creek, used it. They wanted their hills to last. This is the foundation of a hill on the left, and it's the foundation of a hill on the right. So they built with diagonal construction. Boom. Where is it? I don't see it. Yep, there it is. There it is. So, there you have it. I'm going to show you the same seam I showed you before to give you that diagonal. 45 to the flow. There's the flow. Friday, August 26th, here in Dinosaur Valley State Park in northern Texas. And we're just here watching the volunteers re-uncover the Acrocanthosaurus footprints that were made here approximately 113 million years ago in this riverbed. And also to look at the structure of the river itself. In the bottom layer of the riverbed, we don't see any section seams. It's all one molded structure. Then we have the soft layer that's been eroded out below this harder structural layer, okay? And these are sectioned. Now, as we can see, we've got a pointer into the creek, right? Another pointer into the creek. I just want to get up here and show you what's happening, the diagonal construction of the ancients. These diagonals are 45s to the flow of the river. So there's the pointer showing us that this is a built structure. We have some parallel lines, but then we parallel to the flow. But then we have again the diagonal seam, not crack, not fracture, that ends in a pointer. You can barely see it. Directly across the river. Sometimes we get the pointers pointing back, right? But I always look at the pointers across the river as signs that it's a built river. Now here's a pointer that's pointing because we have the diagonal construction, but then it meets a line that goes parallel for a while, right? But it's still diagonal construction. See how that meets that? They're all different sized and different shaped blocks because that's strong building. So we have this what looks to be natural at first glance sectioning, right? But the pointers consistently tell us the diagonal construction. You see these lines, these seams, not fractures, not cracks, these seams in ancient concrete. Now some seams do come apart over time, and then you have the pieces breaking out, as we see, you know, because the seams are weaker than the rest of it. So you'll have broken seams. Normally the seams are integral. So you can see this, you can't really see it there, but there it is. And they're strong, they're holding together strongly. You can barely even see the seams sometimes, you know, in the ancients' work. Here's one that's really, really good. So you can see how strong that is. It's lasted the millennia. We don't know how old this is. But the consistent diagonal construction gives us pointers back and pointers in across the creek. They built with many different angles, right, to achieve different sized and different shaped stones that still, well, concrete sections, not natural geology, that still eventually come out, that still eventually get eroded out because the river is too strong, takes away the softer layer, the softer earthquake mitigating layer, and then the sections fall in. So that's what's happening. But still, the riverbed, the bottom, the bedrock, shall we say, the concrete that the ancients laid down to create the course of the river still stays here, no matter what happens on the banks. So slowly the banks get eroded, but the river is still here. So the hills on either side are still here, you know. So no matter how many of these get eroded, the river will still run the same way it was meant to run by the ancients who built it. So there's another point pointing in. Again, we've got a sort of ragged line that ends in a point that goes with the parallel to the flow of the river section there. So always different section sizes, always different section shaped to keep the building strong. Completely opposite to what we do. We use the same blocks, right? But they went with different shapes, different sizes. There's a little bit of a curve to that. But primarily in the layer above the softer earthquake mitigating layer, they have diagonal construction mixed with the parallel to the flow of the river construction. So the pointer tells all. I'm just gonna, you can be there. You don't have to. The pointer tells all. Now we got another point pointing in this way. They really used big sections. I mean, these are astoundingly large, you know. And then they use small ones. So they're mixing their sizes, they're mixing their shapes. Could have been 1,000, 10,000, a million, 10 million, 100 million, or more years ago. These footprints are dated because they believe it's geology. So they've dated the geology, and so they date the footprints, but who knows when it was built. So let's just take a tour down this really beautiful concrete the ancients laid down, because they wanted this river to be right here, and they built it really strong. But even so, it is coming apart, you know, little by little. You gotta wonder how old this thing is. Look at these seams, they're so strong for all this time. So meticulously done. In geology, well, with a straight face, we'll call these cracks and fractures. Well, it's not fracturing, okay? It's not breaking apart, it's being joined strongly together, really, really strongly. And only as the sections, the different size and different shaped sections, are being undercut as the river takes out the earthquake mitigating layer below. Only when that happens do the sections begin to break out at the seams. So then, instead of having a seam that's that strong, we have a seam that's that strong. So we have the two. We have the one that's not broken out yet, and the one that's being broken out. So little by little, the river finds a weakness in the seams. So even on one side of this, we have a strong seam on the left and a seam that's breaking out on the right. So strong seam right here, one that's starting to break out. Why? Because this guy's been undercut by erosion, little by little, and they all end up downstream in this big pile. But they have lasted this long. It's amazing. Strong seam, super strong seam. Let's take a photo. We have the pointer, and we can also see very clearly the texturing that they've done on this particular section, and on all the sections here. It's rather reminiscent of the Bosnian Pyramids claystone blocks that are used to create that structure. Here we get a little glimpse into the interior. We're looking at the interior of these sections so we can see it's homogeneous material, right? Okay. That's harder than I thought. Yeah.
So there's this guy on the
Very hard. Huh.
NDF team.
Interesting. Yeah, because you don't see many cracks or fractures. You just see sections coming out whole, but these two have cracks and fractures. Interesting. You know, there's no cracks or fractures in this guy right here. But then next to him, we do have that. Very interesting. So we have the erosion as the river goes down, 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 eroding the soft earthquake mitigating layer below, right? Taking it out. And then the strong structural layers eventually come down. They eventually break out. But look how strong they are right now. They're still so strong even though a lot of the clay below is eroded. And you can see it's clay, soft earthquake mitigating clay, just like in the Bosnian Pyramid Complex. So you can just break it up. That's what they use for their soft material often across the world. So soft earthquake mitigating clay, and yet this crumbly soft stuff lasted millennia or longer than millennia, maybe millions of years. But little by little the water just take it out. Then you have this hard structural layers of much stronger material that was heated up to be super strong and hold the clay in place. So that's what this is doing here. And just a very few pieces have cracks and fractures. The rest just break out as huge blocks. No cracks, no fractures, perfectly integral. We'll just wash the clay off from my fingers that was in the soft earthquake mitigating layer that made this riverbank last so long. It was this protective soft layer that kept earthquakes from perturbing this bank of the Biloxi River. So we're walking back, and you can see the diagonal construction down here too, heading downstream on the Biloxi River. So I was walking back to the car and I noticed this interesting feature in the hillside, which is a line that travels vertically through at least 20 layers. I mean, let's see. It's hard to count the layers because they don't match. But let's just move down. You see that vertical line moving through all those layers. Now, those are time periods according to geology. So how's one line moving through all those layers, right? Now these are soft, crumbly gypsum layers, and underneath it we have this more formidable, larger, stronger gypsum layer. We call it gypsum. I don't know what the ancients called it, but they thought of it as concrete, not rock. And we can see a section line right here, which I just noticed. It starts here, and it's vertical, and it's going up, 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 slowly, slowly, completely integral. So that's a straight vertical line through the sedimentary layer. Well, how's that happening? How is that happening? Well, it's happening the same way that the straight vertical line through 20 crumbly sedimentary layers is happening. These are layer cakes laid down by the ancients. On the left, they laid down that section, and then they laid down this section. After they had laid down this more fundamental, larger layer that's in much bigger sections. Okay? So that's their technique. Now, whether they did this manually, which I doubt, or whether they did this with some kind of help from 3D or 4D printing, I don't know. We are here at beautiful Rock Creek in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains, just north of Nevada City, California. Let's look at diagonal seams in ancient concrete. Now this is a persistent, consistent theme of my videos because all we find is the lower layers of creek beds and riverbeds, 45-degree angle diagonal seams in that construction. An approximate 45 to the flow of the river, or we could say an approximate 45 to the line between the hills. Okay, so let's check it out. I'm just going to follow this line, all right? So that line goes through. The reason there was a little shrub there is because it found a little space in this seam to grow. We're going to follow this seam along. We're going to see what angle it is to the flow of the river. So we see it's a 45 to the flow of the river, just as we saw in Texas. Now we're all the way across the continent. Texas is in essentially the middle of the continent. So we're half a continent away, and we have the same 45-degree angle riverbed construction. Let's move over here, and we'll see how that's a 45 but going the other way. So we have two different 45-degree angles, right? And guess what? They meet right here. So that's that's the meeting point right there. And that's the meeting point right there of those angles. Okay, so I'm going to follow that along. There it goes. So those seams, those integral seams, tell us, because they are at a 45, they tell us that this is a riverbed. Now we didn't need to be told that because we have the river, we have the creek flowing, right? But all these seams are at 45s to the flow of the river, which is that way. We could also say these are at 45-degree angles to the line between the hills. Got a hill on the left, got a hill on the right. All right, so we're going to move downstream. This might have been a channel that was consciously built. In that case, this is simply a section face on the right. And of course, inside there, we got a section face on the left, creating that channel. But we have a parallel line right here. We could call it a seam. It's so integral, it's hard to even really see it, except for the coloration. If the coloration wasn't here, you might not even notice the seam. It's so strong. These angles are approximate 45s to the flow of the river, which is that way. So this huge structure right here, this huge block, is telling us that this is a riverbed. It's saying, look at this 45-degree angle we have. You're in a riverbed. Oh, okay. I'll watch out for water then. It's a message to the future. It's just that the future isn't paying attention because we've been schooled in something called geology. Then we have the similar 45s, right? We can see that angle here, and it meets the opposing 45 right there. All right. Continues on. You see the seam continue on way down there. Parallel seam there, parallel seams in the river banks. So all those are 45s approximately to the flow of the river, right? Then we move down here and we see these angles. Approximate 45s to the flow of the river. There's the angle. There's the river flow. So all we see is opposing 45-degree lines. More 45-degree lines. Let's pull back and see what this looks like. And we'll notice that it's closely paralleling the section on the left, right? And we have two parallel lines that go and go and go. Okay? So, then more parallel lines. All we see is opposing 45s in this riverbed. We can just look down here. Okay? in this other layer. It's so obviously constructed because we see the geometry. And pulling back, we see again this the incredible scale of the building and the smooth faces of these 45-degree angles, right? And this seam goes all the way back here. So let's start here. This is the seam, right? This section face is essentially regular, and it joins this section face very strongly. It's not a fracture, it's not breaking apart, it's strong, integral. And then we have the smooth section face, like the side of a building. And by the way, it's inclined. It's inclined into the face of the uphill side of the creek. Really, really strong engineering. It's not leaning the other way. So this is really smart building, because the weight of the material is leaning to the left toward the uphill side. So that's what we also find in the hills in South Africa. All the material is inclining into the face of the hill, whichever way you're facing. Same with the structures in Bosnia. It's always inclined in. So amazing engineering. So all these lines, which appear chaotic and random, are actually engineered. But this is where the playfulness of the ancients comes in, okay? When we're children, we pick up a paintbrush, we immediately start to play. So we're masters of play when we're 3 or 4 years old. But we lose that because of our education. And Monet said that the only thing that he had to recover from in later life as a master painter was his education, his training. So once he recovered from that, he was able to truly paint masterpieces because he recovered his playfulness, you know? So advanced engineers had the ability to create whatever they wanted with this material that we call stone, but which is in fact ancient concrete, magic recipes of concrete mixed by very smart people in the past, very smart races, whether we would call them human or not, hard to know. And they also had the ability to recapture the playfulness of youth and to do beautiful texturing of the tops, beautiful shapes. Geology would call this erosion. I would say that many of these surfaces were created exactly as we find them. So this pool here, with all the curves in it, is a result of highly advanced people playing with their material because they can. Also, we know that in the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, the advanced people who built those pyramids, long before the pharaohs got there to play the game of kings, by the way, the larger pyramids were not built by the pharaohs at all. The smaller pyramids were built by the pharaohs to emulate the larger pyramids, and the smaller pyramids are already crumbling in the shadow of these giant, sophisticated pyramids that were built probably millions of years before, or at least hundreds of thousands of years before the pharaohs ever got there. The pharaohs were royal refugees from the exploded planet Tiamat, and they crash landed in Antarctica, and then they came to Cairo and said, oh, let's enslave the people and play the game of kings. So we find in the Great Pyramid and in the other astonishing larger pyramids on the Giza Plateau, built long before the pharaonic dynasties, an engineering that shows us that they understood that earthquake mitigation could be achieved best by using stones that were unique. They were odd sizes, always different sizes. They understood that the earth will have earthquakes and that their construction needed to resist those tectonic forces, those massive tectonic forces, and that the best way to resist them was to create different angles so the stresses could be dissipated throughout their structures. Now, I also want to note that these rivulets in this creek bed here when the water is low and there's just a little bit of water, they're showing us where the channels are. And the channels, I would argue, were created in ancient times purposely to channel water in a specific way. I would argue that this is not erosion. I would argue that this curving line was created exactly as you see it, with essentially no erosion over time, because this material is so hard. I would argue that this channel here was created with essentially no erosion over time. And a geologist would say, well, of course it was carved by the water, because we know that the Grand Canyon was carved a mile deep over time by water. But in fact, that's incorrect. The Grand Canyon was not carved by water. The Grand Canyon was created in a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes by electric discharge from another planet, and all that material was thrown up into space or up into our atmosphere. So some came back down to Earth, but a lot of it was thrown up into space and landed on other planets. This is not necessarily the result of erosion over time. I believe that this was created specifically by advanced architects, advanced engineers who wanted to channel water just like this, specifically for the purpose of creating turbulence, and that turbulence would create negative ions. Negative ions are very healthy for life, so they kill viruses and bacteria. We sell negative ion producing machines for homes and offices to increase the vitality of the air, to increase the potential of the air we're breathing to give us health. So this is a health-giving channel right here. And up there's a little health-giving channel. It's creating turbulence. I would argue that the way they shape their river and their riverbeds and creek beds creates the maximum beneficial turbulence in the water. Now, Victor Schauberger has diagnosed riverbeds and creek beds extensively and said that to advance our technology, we must comprehend and copy nature. But this is not nature. This is building in the ancient past. So what we would want to do if we were going to copy the past is to copy ancient techniques for creating curving, channeled, 45-degree angle sections that move the water in specific ways and whose sections and layers stay strong throughout the ages. But I think it's a question primarily of water movement, water turbulence, water direction, and that the water is the key to it all. So I think that the advanced ancient engineers, the advanced ancient architects were designing their 45-degree angle base structure creeks and their channeled creek beds, right? And their channeled riverbeds, specifically to change water, to work with water, to release the magic of water. You can see the stepping down, by the way, right here. That's concrete. It's concrete with moss on it. So that's that layer that goes across. That's stepping down, right? So they stepped it down. Stepped it down. You can see the stepping. They stepped it down in a regular way, not perfectly right angle. It's not a Roman right angle job, but they stepped their creek down. See how they stepped it? Pretty obvious here. Now I want to measure one more seam because there's another seam here that I didn't measure. So we measured all the way to this one from the left to the right, but then we didn't measure to another seam. So let's see if we can find another seam first. So we've gone about 15, 20 feet, maybe more, and we found the seam. So here it is. And before we measure this section here, okay, I just want to show you again the smoothness of the sides. Not perfect Roman, Grecian, right angle smoothness, but, right, a feeling of being built and an understanding that nature would have no reason to create fractures with this kind of regularity here, right? This regularity. If that's a fracture, it won't go through different sedimentary layers, different eons, as the institutional geologist would call this. Instead, what we have is a line that's essentially straight, even though they're not perfectly straight. And it's a vertical seam that's joining the material together with smooth interior faces. When I say smooth, I mean imperfectly smooth, smoother than one would expect from fracturing. That's all I mean by that, okay? And that lets us know that this is building. So we're here in Gillespie County in a little creek bed, and we're looking at the diagonal construction of the ancients. So we have the flow of the creek, or the meeting of the hills. Hill on one side on the right, hill on the other side on the left. And we look down and we see what we always see, without fail, diagonal construction of the hills. These are hills meeting together in a little valley that then becomes what we call a creek. So we have the diagonal construction, all right? There's the flow of the creek, here's the diagonal, here's the diagonal, here's the diagonal. Then we have another diagonal meeting that diagonal. So we have an arrow pointing up the creek, or up the line of the hill right here. The base of the valleys is diagonal. And here they stepped it down. All right. So this isn't, yes, it has been eroded, but this isn't an accident of nature. They are stepping this down. All right. So see this molded one piece? This goes down, down, down. So it's coming down. So if this was flush, it would be up about here. But it's coming down because they're anticipating going down. So they're leaning their layers as well as stepping their layers. So it's obviously not erosion. You don't see water erosion on this. There's no path of the water, okay? What's been eroded is sections have been taken out by the rushing water, but this concrete has stayed strong. So this mottled concrete that you see, there's no erosion of it. This is the bottom layer, okay? This is what is then the next bottom layer, right? And you don't see erosion from water on these layers. It's all mottled, it's all sharp-edged. There's no smoothing out by the water. So we know that the only erosion that has taken place is that pieces have been taken out. So here's a couple pieces that come out because they're stacking pieces that are not adhered to each other. See how they're not adhered? They're just really close to each other. There's a curving one. Pretty meticulous, right? So the seams are there between them, but they're not adhered. Some are, but some aren't. So like this one might be adhered to some degree, but eventually it could come out if the water force is strong enough, you know? So then you get these pieces like this. So obviously this is not natural. We saw this exact same joining construction in the crevice between the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun and the Bosnian Pyramid of Love. So this stepped crevice, which this is, a crevice between hills, but in Bosnia it's a crevice between pyramids, which join hills, by the way. This joining construction keeps those two pyramids in Bosnia together, just like the joining construction keeps these two hills together. We can also speculate that the hills were built for a specific reason beyond having creeks and rivers in between them. In other words, we can speculate that the hills were multi-purpose beyond water flow and negative ion generation from the turbulence of the water. Negative ions being very healthy for humans and for animals. One other possibility for the motivation to build hills in the past is large asteroid impact. So if you have two hills and a large asteroid comes, the hills explode. So here's one hill, right? And there's a hill over here. The asteroid hits them and this hill explodes into the valley that's here. And this hill explodes into the valley that's here. And that's going to mitigate large asteroid impacts. Mountains and hills will do that. If you have a flat surface, then you don't have the mitigation. Now, an inner Earth civilization does have the motivation to mitigate large asteroid impacts. As you live in a house, and not on the roof of a house, you live inside the house. People built planets to live inside of, not on the surface. If you're on the surface, you're subject to global flooding, global droughts, asteroids crushing your your village. You're subject to cosmic rays that are very unhealthy. You're subject to surprise attacks from hostile invaders. You're subject to solar flashes. So there's an endless list of reasons to be inside a planet and not outside it. Then the question is, how do you generate heat and light? And that's been solved. You know, you can generate light with sound. You can generate heat with sound. And you can have yourself an artificial sun inside a planet. And that's what ancient races did who wanted to live on or in a planet. They lived in the planet. Other races have transcended that sort of physicality, and that's what they did. So here in the 3D world, we're oddly living on the surface of a hollow planet. I mean, we're not supposed to be on the surface, but it's okay, you know, here we are. And we are looking at the building of the ancients. And this building undoubtedly has been around for millions and millions of years. When I say millions of years, I don't mean a few million years, because there was no Big Bang. We know that, right? By the evidence. There's no evidence to support the Big Bang theory. Beings in this universe have had an infinite amount of time to advance, because there was no beginning to the universe as far as science is concerned. Our best evidence tells us that there was no beginning a mere, say, several billion years ago. But we have much, much more time to advance. That means the technology of building anything is extremely advanced on the part of the races who have been around much longer than our little race here on Terra, which we call Earth. So, we could call the technology that builds hills, that makes insistent, consistent diagonal seams, diagonal construction of hills, diagonal to the line between the hills. This construction technique of building hills is an immortal technology brought forward through time by the ancients. Yes, time does exist. I mean, it's very cool and new agey to say time doesn't exist, but it does exist because we have events that happen as the effect of other events. We have growth, which takes time. Organisms grow through time. They don't just grow instantaneously. So we have a helical structure to life and to solar systems and galaxies, and so time is moving like a vortex helically along, and we are in that helical vortex, and we feel the seasons as we come around and around and around in that helix. But we are not in the same place we were before each spring. We are further down the road in the helix. We're not in a circle, we are in a spiral. And that is what time is. We have constant threads, let's say, moving through this changing toroidal universe. And one of those threads is the immortal technology of the ancients.